You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. So far in our ongoing election series, we've spoken with voters about why they're feeling so uncertain about the future of the country, how U.S. foreign policy will factor into their vote. While opinions may differ on these questions, no single issue may be important to voters or as divisive as a woman's right to choose. Roe v. Wade was overturned on June 24, 2022, and for the past 2 years, Americans have watched as the long arm of the Dobbs decision has grasped long-held reproductive freedoms, and we're already starting to see the far-reaching consequences. In Alabama, where the future of in vitro fertilization was recently cast into doubt, the Alabama State Supreme Court ruled in February that fertilized embryos are considered children, and the judge in the case cited Dobbs repeatedly. In the weeks that followed the Alabama ruling, IVF clinics were thrown into chaos as they tried to figure out what this meant for the patients' futures. Our producer Elise Manukian spoke with a woman in Birmingham, Alabama, about how her family has gotten caught up in this decision.
I remember watching the news one day after Roe v. Wade, and I remember, I can't tell you who or what, but I do recall reading that, IVF could come under attack. Did I ever expect that it would happen to me? Absolutely not.
Her name is Latorya Beasley. She's a therapist, originally from Huntsville. Latorya and her husband had their first child together through IVF last year, and now they're in the midst of the process to have their second one. Here's Latorya.
To be honest, sometimes Americans, we can be a little spoiled. We know things are happening, but until it happens to us, it may not affect us. And I don't want to speak for all Americans, but I think that's how I was living my life. Oh, yeah, it could happen, but surely it won't happen to me.
When Latorya Beasley conceived her first child through IVF in 2022, she planned it out to a T.
I was type A. I used Google Forms, and then it moved over into an Excel spreadsheet of my days and the different symptoms that I had.
But when Alabama's Supreme Court decision came down in February of this year, Latorya wasn't sure what this would mean for her current IVF care.
I'm in a small group for women who deal with infertility and different losses and just getting pregnant. So the Tuesday following, we kind of started to discuss what that would look like. And there was a lot of anxiety just amongst ourselves.
The next day, Latorya went back to her IVF clinic, Alabama Fertility.
That Wednesday, I had a doctor's appointment. My doctor came in immediately, and I could tell. I knew something wasn't right because she normally comes in and she's just upbeat, but she didn't have that same upbeat. It was almost forced. And that's when she told us, hey, I don't know what's going to happen, but right now we're moving forward, business as usual, but things could change. So I actually had my husband on the phone. And when I left out of the appointment, I asked him, I said, hey, what did you think about that? And he's like, I think she's being extra. I don't think anything is going to happen. He said, and even if it did, it wouldn't impact us. I mean, you've already started medicine. Those were his words exactly. And I was like, I don't know, babe. I'm feeling a little uneasy about it.
Leaving the clinic that day, Latorya went to go pick up some medicine. As she's pulling away from the pharmacy, she heard on the radio that the University of Alabama at Birmingham, which is the big hospital in the state, was pausing its IVF treatment.
And I knew then. I said, all it's going to take is one person, one clinic to start the snowball effect. And with UAB being the largest hospital in Alabama, smaller clinics will definitely follow.
So to understand why the clinics were pausing, it's helpful to know a bit about how IVF works. You might have heard about test tube babies. This is how they're made. An egg is retrieved from the womb and combined with a sperm in a lab to create an embryo. And then one or more of those embryos is implanted into a patient's uterus. That process is called an embryo transfer. The embryos that don't get used are frozen and stored. If patients don't need them or if there's something wrong with the embryo, they're often discarded. That's why Alabama's Supreme Court ruling was so controversial, and why it affected Latorya. It meant IVF providers, as well as patients who seek out the treatment, could face criminal charges if anything happens to the embryos, even if something happens by accident. Unfortunately for Latorya, all of this legal confusion caused her to miss a critical window.
One of my girlfriends that's in a small group with me, we are like neck and neck with our transfers. She just did her egg retrieval. And so throughout this process, we've been like, have you gotten your date yet? Have you gotten your date yet? My transfer was scheduled for March the 4th and hers was scheduled for March the 11th. So she actually got a call from our facility early in the morning telling her that you're still in the clear. I just took it as that would be the same thing for me. Well, come to find out, I got a call later on that afternoon, and I couldn't tell you what the girl said. She was just like, I'm so sorry. I just blanked out. I was sad. Initially, I was just devastated. People just don't understand the emotional, financial, physical effects that it takes to go through the process. This is money. Every time I go to the doctor, it's a $30 copay for monitoring fees. These are essentially all of these appointments that I've had leading up into this were really for nothing. And, emotionally also, you kind of have this vision in your head of like, if it works out, I'll be pregnant this, and then I'll have a due date of this. You start to live in like this imaginary world of what ifs. And that was what I wanted. Unfortunately, it didn't plan out that way, but it's what I wanted. And it was what I wanted to work towards.
That's the sad irony of all of this. In an effort to protect children, even ones that haven't been born yet, Alabama's Supreme Court ruling was actually making it more difficult for families to conceive. Since 1987, more than 1 million babies have been born in the U.S. through IVF, according to Pew Research. Frequently, it causes families to have twins or triplets, which is even more babies than they were expecting or hoping for. So isn't IVF the pro-life choice? A Republican senator from Alabama, Tommy Tuberville, was actually confronted about this by a reporter from MSNBC.
That's what the whole abortion issue is about. So
this really isn't about abortion. It's about IVF and the concern that now families might not have access to it.
But it's about the same direction. But I agree. But people need to have access. People need to have. We need more kids. We need the people to have the opportunity to have kids. I'd have to look at the entire bill and how it's written. I have not seen it.
Supreme Court decision.
Well, I know that, but I'd have to look. I haven't looked at it. But this is state issue.
Women aren't going to be able to have IVF treatments already in some places.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
What do you say to them?
Unfortunate.
Latorya watched this awkward interaction unfold on the news.
I was like yelling at the TV the whole time I saw one of our great senators answer that question. It was like, what? That doesn't make any sense.
Latorya and other IVF patients and providers protested the ruling at the state capitol. But the one thing she won't do is leave Alabama.
That is the thing that makes me cringe the most. If you want to get me aggravated, tell me to leave and go get treatment somewhere else. You will see a different side of Tory, because the reality is I am a normal, average American, and most average Americans cannot just up and leave in the middle of the night to just go and receive treatment hours away. Like, that is so unrealistic. I live here. I live in Alabama. I pay taxes in Alabama. All of my support system is in Alabama. I just feel that I deserve to have access to healthcare in Alabama. My clinic is less than 10 miles away from me. Why should I have to go to wherever? Because the reality is I'm surrounded by Republican states, so it could happen there. I don't even know where I would go, to be honest.
Alabama has since passed a new law granting IVF providers immunity from the court's ruling. Latorya's clinic was able to resume services. And on Monday, March 25th, she went to see her doctor.
This morning was my mid-cycle testing, and so my ovaries are clear and everything is progressing the way it should. Endometrial lining is nice and thick, and my doctor after lab testing, did say that we could go ahead and proceed with a tentative transfer for April the 8th.
This should be great news, but Latorya knows she still has a long road ahead.
I would like to say that I was excited, but I wasn't. You're happy. You're like, okay, one step closer. Let's just get through the next hurdle. Let's just get through the next hurdle and then we'll be happy. And so realistically, I know that even after we transfer, The embryo will be put in, but then the next hurdle will be, let's just sustain it. And then you want to get to a heartbeat. And once you get to a heartbeat, you want to, in our mind, we say, well, once we get out of that first trimester, we'll feel more calm. The reality is I know I likely won't. You'll always have that worry, but my goal is to just be as present as I can, to enjoy each day, each step.
And even though clinics and doctors are supposed to be protected, Latorya isn't sure the new law goes far enough. Because the law doesn't address fetal personhood, the question at the heart of the ruling. That leaves the door open to future challenges.
The bill or the law that was written into place, it did not actually address personhood for the embryos. We're in an election year. Depending on how this election pans out, everything could be uprooted again.
For now, Latorya and her family got an okay from the doctor to go on vacation after her transfer date. She and her husband are taking their 1-year-old daughter to Disney World. She found out there's actually a lab where she can get her testing done inside of the park, so Latorya can continue her treatment from the happiest place on earth.
That story was reported by our producer, Elise Manukian. Latorya's story caught national attention in the weeks following the Alabama Supreme Court ruling. She was invited to share her experiences at a roundtable with Health Secretary Xavier Becerra, and then was invited to be a guest of First Lady Jill Biden at the March State of the Union address. In the president's speech, Joe Biden actually mentioned Latorya by name.
What her family had got through should never have happened. Unless Congress acts, it could happen again. So tonight, let's stand up for families like hers.
Latorya said it felt good to know what was important to her was also important to the President of the United States. You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, what's at stake for reproductive rights in the 2024 presidential election? We talk with experts about the future of America after Roe and who the future Roe may be. But first, we hear about one woman's experience with crisis pregnancy centers. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. While many Americans' lives have changed significantly since the reversal of Roe v. Wade, the battle over abortion rights has been raging long before the Dobbs decision. In Texas, even before Senate Bill 8, the controversial heartbeat law, there were major restrictions affecting pregnant people in the state.
Roe was the floor, not the ceiling, because even before, abortion was not very accessible. People who are wealthy will have more access always, but it's the low-income people of color that are always disproportionately burdened by abortion bans.
Maliha Aziz works for the Texas Equal Action Fund, an abortion fund serving North and East Texas. She emigrated to the U.S. from Pakistan as a teenager. She dreamed of becoming a chef, but a twist of fate set her on a different path.
When I was younger, it's not what I thought I'd be doing, working as a deputy director of an abortion fund in Texas. I don't know who grows up thinking this is what I'm going to do. My personal experiences dictated my professional path, and they still do.
At 20, Maliha found out she was pregnant.
I was on contraception, I was on birth control, but sometimes it doesn't work. I just happened to be one of those people it didn't work for. I was in denial. I eventually caved. I took the pregnancy test. Sure enough, it was positive. I took 6 more, and they were all positive, and I had to accept that I was indeed pregnant. I didn't want to be pregnant. I wasn't expecting to be pregnant, so it wasn't good news to me. It was more of a shocking news to me. So I think I had to deal and process, this is it, this is happening, this is reality. I had so many emotions and feelings and thoughts going through my mind. And I was very back and forth. What am I going to do? What does this mean? And then I decided I did not want to have a child. And the option I was leaning towards was to have an abortion. because I was new here to the country, to the state, to everything, navigating a new legal system, a new medical system, new educational system. Everything was new. It didn't work like that in my country. So I needed some help. I called one of my cousins in medical school. I told her that I needed an ultrasound and I didn't have money to pay for it without insurance. I needed a place that could do it free of cost or cheaper. And she sent me a list of places from a Google search that she did. And I'm looking at these random places that claim to be clinics to just go there and confirm that I'm pregnant and for them to tell me how far along I am. And the list that she sent me included crisis pregnancy centers. And at that time, I didn't know what they were. And she definitely didn't know what they were. She would have never sent me there.
The clinic is called the White Rose Women's Center, and it advertises itself as an abortion counseling clinic. White Rose is one of around 2,500 crisis pregnancy centers across the U.S. Like the one Maliha visited in Dallas, Texas, most are religiously affiliated and offer resources needed to carry a pregnancy to term or support families with children.
And the first thing I see is two women, slightly older, dressed in white lab coats. And I see biblical imagery around, so you see crosses and Jesus. The first thing that the women had asked me to do was to take a pregnancy test to confirm that I was pregnant. Then they told me I probably don't want to tell my parents that I'm pregnant because first pregnancies result in miscarriage often. So there's no point telling them if they're going to be mad at me anyway. Then they asked my partner and I to sit in a room and watch a video. But it was a video of a man wearing a lab coat, so I guess posing as a doctor, and taking surgical instruments and ripping apart a fully grown human child limb from limb. Like it was a low, cheap, budget, scary, creepy horror movie. And they basically told you if you have an abortion, this is what you're doing to your baby. Running through my mind was, how triggering must this be for someone who's had an actual miscarriage? Or, it was a very disturbing thing. They closed the door and made us feel like we really couldn't leave till that was over. They also told me they can help me sign up for WIC or other resources to be able to help support a child. Abortion wasn't even an option for them.
Many centers claim to offer an array of reproductive care services, but according to advocates and regulators, these facilities don't offer abortions, birth control, or referrals to medical professionals. Physicians and lawmakers have accused these centers of using deception, delay tactics, and disinformation to prevent women from accessing legitimate health care. And in this case, the White Rose Center told Maliha that the abortion pill was illegal in Texas.
I wish I had thought this through, but I guess I was vulnerable and I left because I thought I was not going to be able to have a medication abortion in Texas. Many years later, I found out that was never the case back then. Now, obviously, it's different, but back then, Texas had never actually banned the abortion pill.
Misinformed by the staff at the Crisis Pregnancy Center, Maliha went out of state for her medication abortion. Her family helped her pull together the $2,000 needed to cover the trip, overnight stay and procedure at the Colorado Springs Planned Parenthood, the same Planned Parenthood where a self-proclaimed warrior for the babies shot and killed 3 people the following year. Even though the procedure was at the time legal right there at home, crisis pregnancy centers are one of the many battlegrounds in the fight over abortion access.
They have one agenda, which is to deter you from having an abortion. They're not interested in your well-being. They're not interested in your health, mental health, or anything. They want to make sure abortion is not an option for anybody. They will pose as clinics, and very few of them have actual licensed medical professionals because they're under the guise of social services, but they totally have the white lab coat thing going, so they definitely intentionally mislead people.
Millions of dollars in federal funds currently flow to these organizations through the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, also known as TANF. Ahead of the 2024 election, the Biden administration has proposed cutting funds for crisis pregnancy centers as part of an attempt to increase abortion access. House Republicans responded with legislation that would block the federal government from restricting these funds.
They take money away from social welfare programs like TANF and then use the funds that are actually meant to help people that need supplies for their children, their families, and then they dangle it in front of you as a quid pro quo that if you do this, then we'll give you this one pack of diapers. But they are places that need to be dismantled, defunded, and completely shut down because they are dangerous. They're actually putting people's lives and health at risk.
Now that abortions are completely illegal in Texas, the barriers to obtaining reproductive care there are extremely high.
We can't really help people access abortions within our state, not because we don't believe in the cause, but because if we do something that is illegal, then that affects our ability to serve our community. So we can't do that.
So Maliha does what she can. At the T Fund, where she works, she started an anti-abortion center campaign. They provide diapers and formula like an emergency pregnancy center would, but they also help women and birthing people make sense of their real options.
People can come there, no questions asked, no counseling needed, take what they need as much as they need and leave.
It's an alternative to the alternative. Maliha's story was brought to us by Elise Minukian and Sienna Barnes. Maliha Aziz is the deputy director of the Texas Equal Action Fund, which provides financial and emotional support to individuals who lack the means to seek abortions or other kinds of reproductive care. The White Rose Center in Dallas was not available to comment for this story. Maliha returned to the White Rose Center in Dallas years after her experience to confront the anti-abortion clinic's director. We actually have the sound from that conversation.
I was lied to, and I'm trying to understand what happened.
Okay. So what were you told that you said was a lie?
The fact that the abortion pill was so dangerous it was banned in Texas. I was told that I'd get breast cancer, and I was told that I'd never have kids again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What I'm reading between the lines is that you're searching for closure on an abortion, and I can't help that.
This sound comes from a new film called Preconceived, about women navigating the complicated abortion landscape. You can watch the movie at preconceivedfilm.com. If you want to learn more about crisis pregnancy centers or learn more about the work of the T Fund, visit their website at teafund.org. "2024 is another pivotal year for reproductive rights in America. Less than 2 years after a conservative majority on the Supreme Court reversed Roe, the issue is once again back on the docket, with 2 scheduled cases about abortion. Advocates argue these cases, paired with Alabama, have more in common than just reproductive health care. The Supreme Court majority will have to contend with the consequences of eradicating a decades-long legal precedent and the confusion and chaos created after the Dobbs decision. Joining me now are experts who can help us make sense of these cases before the court and the future of reproductive care. Professor Mary Ziegler from the University of California Davis School of Law, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks for having me.
And Dr. Jamila Perritt, CEO of Physicians for Reproductive Health. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
Well, at the time the draft decision that was eventually entered in the Dobbs case was first being circulated, advocates of continued legal access to abortion said, look, if this draft that we're looking at becomes the decision, watch out. This isn't just about surgical abortion. They're coming next for mifepristone. They're coming next for birth control. They're coming next for Plan B. They're coming next for same-sex marriage. They're coming next for Lawrence v. Texas, which vacated sodomy laws used to prosecute same-sex physical relations. And people who made those predictions then were dismissed, told they were overreacting, reassured that all Dobbs was meant to do is return abortion to the states where it was always meant to be. In the nearly 2 years since Dobbs, who was right? Was Dobbs an event that ended up having wide or narrow application, both in the strict legal sense and politically. Professor Ziegler, let's start with you.
I think we've already seen that Dobbs has had reverberations even outside the context of abortion. It's energized supporters of the idea that a fetus is a rights-holding person in a variety of contexts, including the Constitution. We saw that expressed in Alabama when the state Supreme Court issued a decision on wrongful death and fetal rights that had a massive impact on in vitro fertilization in the state. We've seen decisions on contraception and parents' rights. And of course, we have no less than 2 U.S. Supreme Court cases on abortion this term, which is very unusual. So the question definitely has not gone back to the people and their elected representatives. It's very much stayed in courts.
Dr. Perritt, did you anticipate that, in effect, the floodgates were going to open once Roe was taken down?
Absolutely. I completely agree with Professor Ziegler. We anticipated this happening, certainly when the Dobbs decision leaked, but we also saw this coming more than a decade or 2 ago. And for those of us who have been on the front lines, I'm still a practicing OBGYN, I provide abortion care, we could see the impact that a lot of these restrictions leading up to the Dobbs case were having on our ability to care for our communities. And certainly Dobbs was a pivot point. It is a pivot point, and allowed the door to open. As Professor Ziegler said, folks have been emboldened and are enthusiastic about their ability to move these anti-abortion pieces of legislation statewide, and it has had devastating effects on our communities.
When the Alabama ruling came out on in vitro fertilization, the rationale presented was the people of this state, elected leaders and representatives who share their view of the personhood of embryos and fetuses, a view shaped by biblical teaching, and so it follows that our decision reflects those principles. It was a legal decision deeply rooted in the teaching of one particular religion. Did you see this kind of thing coming?
Absolutely. You know, the need to access IVF and assisted reproductive technologies is not separate or distinct from your need to access all kinds of reproductive health care, including abortion care. And one of the most dangerous things that we are seeing is that we have folks with no science background, no medical training at all, that are attempting to legislate medical care. So the fallout, the implications is going to continue to be far-reaching. And I think it's important that we talk about this question about being voted on by the people in the context of longstanding attacks on the democratic process. These decisions would not be possible if we had not experienced widespread voter disenfranchisement, particularly in places in the South, particularly among voters of color and Black women in particular in our communities. And so these things definitely go hand in hand.
As a lawyer, Professor Ziegler, do you see a problem in that rationale? Look, people vote. Elections have consequences. They elect, in the case of the judiciary in Alabama, they elect a great many of the judges. This is the sense of the people who live here, that if you create these embryos, they cannot be destroyed in this way. It's like killing children.
Well, I think one of the interesting questions is whether that's what voters in Alabama actually decided, right? Because we saw a pretty big backlash to this very ruling not long after it was handed down in a state where, more than 2/3 of voters support access to in vitro fertilization. So one of the things I think that's become clear from this ruling is that while many conservative Americans may have in principle thought an embryo or a fetus is a person or a rights-holding person, they hadn't necessarily gamed out entirely what that would mean. We see this today still, right? We see people saying, I think if a fetus is a person, what that means is that I get child support while I'm pregnant, or I get to drive in the HOV lane. They don't necessarily think this is going to mean criminal or civil liability for healthcare providers in the context of IVF or abortion or any number of other contexts. So I'm not sure that just as a descriptive matter, what the Chief Judge was saying is accurate. And then there's just interesting questions about separation of church and state, if it is true, if a majority of voters, for example, want to write a particular faith tradition into the law, is that constitutional, right? Given that there are, of course, people who belong to other faith traditions or no faith tradition at all who live in those communities as well. So I think there are a lot of complicated constitutional and troubling constitutional issues raised by the court's ruling, and we're likely to see, I think, more of the same from the Alabama Supreme Court going forward in this context.
From the very beginning, after the decision in Roe v. Wade, people who wanted to take that law down, people who wanted to take down the effect of that decision, said, look, the way this should be is that local polities should decide for themselves and for their communities exactly how we proceed in this area. So if we take down Roe and we end up with a patchwork quilt country, a map with states where you can get fertility treatment that results in the creation of many embryos over here, and the techniques featured in this kind of childbirth for a long time over there, and a country with a lot of states where you simply can't. Does that fall afoul of the U.S. Constitution? Does that really threaten the overall civil rights and legal rights of women in the United States? Dr. Perritt and then Professor.
Well, I can't speak to its implications on the Constitution and its impact on that. But what I can say is that when you create a two-tiered system of healthcare, which is essentially what we've done and what the suggestion is here to continue, it is above all a violation of individuals' human rights. Every person has the human right to access this care because they are here. And so when we're thinking about the implications, absolutely, it will have legal implications, but it also has far-reaching implications for an individual's life in that moment and the lives of their family for generations to come. We know what it means to deny people wanted and needed abortion care. We know the long-term implications on the health and well-being of the pregnant person, their children that they already have, and their family for many, many years.
If we ended up with highly different regimes in various places in the country, Dr. Ziegler, which was from the beginning the argument of the opponents of Roe, what's the downside of that for women, for the country at large, for the idea of uniform life under the law in the United States?
Obviously, there's fundamental questions of fairness, that people's rights vary from state to state, and that voters are kind of in some ways unable to do anything about this, right? There's not a way for voters in every state to directly initiate a ballot campaign of the kind we've seen in places like Ohio or Michigan. There are also constitutional questions being raised because, of course, unsurprisingly, it's turning out that conservative states are not happy to just leave it such that every community decides for itself. They've been looking to ensure that their residents can't travel to other states to access abortion. And so we're already starting to see conflicts about the right to travel, about when states can apply their laws to other states, about what courts should do when state laws conflict. And we've even begun to see, I think, pretty clearly that conservatives are hoping to impose a single national solution that kind of gainsays what voters want. And that's why we see two U.S. Supreme Court cases right now. In part, it's not just because progressive groups are seeking to broaden access to abortion. In part, it's because conservatives are seeking to institute some kind of national ban and recognize that the best way to do that for them is probably to rely on the conservative federal judiciary when realistically voters are not going to give them that kind of result.
Dr. Perritt, it's been almost 2 years since Dobbs. Is it your sense that there may be people who think, I understand why abortion laws are on the books, I understand why women might seek one, but I'm not comfortable with it. I'm kind of against it. I wouldn't want to have one myself. I wouldn't want my daughter to have one, who may have been put on notice when they hear a state legislator talking about women having to record their periods for varsity sports programs to ensure that they're not taking birth control pills, that women who are found to be pregnant by their OB may have their movements tracked so they don't go to another state to seek an abortion. Do you think that there are people who might even think of themselves as anti-abortion who say, oh, wait a minute, I didn't think we were going here. I didn't I don't think I'm signing up for that.
I think for sure, what we've seen, particularly following the IVF ruling in Alabama, but even since the Dobbs decision came down almost 2 years ago, are folks who had not previously been engaged in this conversation, who had not been watching for many of the reasons that you already stated, are now paying closer attention, are concerned about the implication for themselves, certainly, and for the folks that they love in their communities. I'm not a politician. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a doctor. I take care of people. And what I know is that no one ever thinks they'll need an abortion until they need an abortion. And once that happens, almost universally, their views change. It is not my intention to convince people that they should agree with abortion or that they should even have an abortion, but instead to say that every person has the right to make a decision for themselves. And if we are in a position where we are deciding for someone else what they can and should do with their own body, with their own lives, then we are on the wrong side of the conversation here.
In the State of the Union address a few weeks ago, a joint session of Congress was treated to the rare spectacle of a president talking politics with justices of the Supreme Court. Now, granted, it was a one-way conversation. The president was at the lectern and the justices were quietly and poker-faced seated in front of him. But Joe Biden, in effect, reminded the members of the high court present that women were powerful political actors. Some people were offended by it. Professor, were you?
I think that the court in Dobbs sort of said as much, right? I mean, President Biden was quoting back the Supreme Court to the Supreme Court, right? It wasn't as if the Supreme Court wasn't engaging with voters. I mean, there's a clear more than one moment in Dobbs where Justice Alito essentially says, this opinion may not be popular, and that's not really our problem. We're not supposed to care about what voters think about us. Or when saying, the question was, do women and other pregnant people rely on access to abortion? And Justice Alito then said, well, I'm not really sure, but it's not my problem. Women can figure it out. Women are politically powerful and they can vote. So I think when you put all of that out there in an opinion that's going to be probably the most important of our generation, certainly one of the best known of our generation, it's not going to be surprising to hear the president quote your own language back to you. So I didn't think it was very surprising. It's also notable, of course, that not all of the people who wrote that opinion were even at the State of the Union. I think there had already been signs of the sort of usual decorum between the court and the president having broken down.
Not necessarily in the court and not necessarily in the ruling, but in the wrestling match over Roe. A lot of the exceptions that were talked about were dismissed as rare cases, not the core question around which the experience of abortion is lived by American women. Did it take long after Dobbs, Dr. Perritt, to see that these exceptions weren't really that exceptional? Women who were miscarrying, women who had unviable fetuses, women who needed DNCs when it was clear a pregnancy was failing, that we got to know these women's names and even knew when they left their states to go elsewhere.
No, it is not unusual. And I think that the classification or even qualification of these as exceptions is absolutely a misnomer. It is extremely common when we think about the fact that anywhere from 15 to 20% of all clinically recognized pregnancies end in miscarriage, then it cannot be uncommon for someone to need access to the same kinds of care we provide for those that are seeking abortion. The medications are the same, the procedures are the same, the care is essentially the same. And when we look at the other exceptions, and often they're linked together under the framework of the Hyde Amendment, the threat to maternal life, rape, and incest, and often those are lifted up as exceptions, for example, in these cases. And as a physician who has attempted to help patients navigate these exceptions, I can say unequivocally, without delay or pause, that exceptions provide no protection for people who need them. It is nearly impossible to navigate access to abortion underneath these exception laws. And then the final thing that I'll say is really looking at the second case that is before the Supreme Court around EMTALA, emergency care, and this question about exceptions, right? The ability to provide abortion care in an emergency. And these exceptions are not playing out in real time in the way the court or litigators are describing or suggesting that they do. When someone presents in the midst of a miscarriage, when someone is having a medical emergency, it is not possible, it is not ethical, it is not morally feasible for us to pause, contact the lawyers and find out, is it safe for me to continue? Is it legally safe for me to deny care for this individual because they are not close enough to death in this moment? And that is what we are being asked to do under these exception rules.
Why were doctors so cautious? Why were doctors so gun-shy after some of these new laws came into effect that even when women were presenting with these conditions, they were reluctant or outright refused to give the protocol-directed treatment in the kind of cases that these women were presenting with?
Because it is not clear-cut. How much bleeding is too much bleeding? How much pain is too much pain? How close do you have to be? How sick do you have to be? The reality is that most medical providers, and I can use myself as an example, I'm the first physician in my family. I don't come from a family of doctors. I carry an enormous amount of student debt and have for many years. And embedded in these laws are the threat of criminal and civil penalties. That means loss of licensure. That means loss of livelihood. I trained for 15 years to become a doctor and have been practicing for more than 20 years. And so this threat that is being weaponized against physicians, against healthcare providers in our medical practice is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's designed to create fear and to cause chaos. So it isn't about the healthcare provider necessarily refusing to provide care in that moment, but wondering when everything is said and done, if I have helped this person complete their miscarriage, if I provided medication or intervened procedurally, will there be a set of lawyers that show up to challenge my license to say, actually, this was not a miscarriage. This was treatment of an abortion, and abortion is illegal in this state.
All throughout our history, in legal terms, individuals have often been at the center of cases that make law for a long time, but we get to know their names because of these cases. Whether it's the pseudonymous Roe of Roe versus Wade, Wong Kim Ark, Dred Scott, Gideon, all kinds of people in all kinds of legal situations. Are we going to have women heading to court, Professor, whose names we may end up knowing someday because they are going to become, unwittingly, the test cases that put some of these new laws on trial, in effect?
I think so. I mean, one of the interesting features of post-Dobbs litigation is that women are going to court using their own names and telling their own stories. So, as you already mentioned, in the pre-Roe era, and really for a long time after that, women use pseudonyms, right? And other pregnant people use pseudonyms for a variety of reasons. And eventually people discovered who they were and told their stories. But now it's often the patients themselves who are telling the stories, right? Who are the ones on the front lines, who are the named plaintiffs. And I think that obviously, too, is changing the conversation because it's a lot easier for Americans to empathize with people when they're telling their own stories and when they're not anonymous, when they're not hiding in the shadows. And so we're already beginning to see this in the trial courts, in the state courts. And I think as these cases move through the courts and become more significant, those names and stories will become even more familiar.
Dr. Perritt, are you practicing in a state where the laws may be changed either not as drastically or every bit as drastically as we've seen in some other places?
I think it would be easy to be able to answer that question yes or no, but I practice and live in the District of Columbia. And because we lack home rule, our laws can be changed at any moment because we are subject to congressional oversight. And so for us, I think folks think about certainly the residents of the District of Columbia as being quote unquote liberal or progressive, and certainly vote in support of abortion access and the ability to be autonomous and exercise agency over your life and your body. But the reality is that we do not have that privilege because we do not have representation in the federal government in the form of a congressperson or a senator with voting power.
I don't want to get too distracted, but I think it's important for our listeners to understand that if you are a voting, tax-paying citizen in the District of Columbia, you have a city council, you have a mayor, and they make laws and they deliberate and they write local statutes, and they can be overruled by congressmen elected in Alabama and Texas and Tennessee and all kinds of other places. And when there is a Republican majority in the House of Representatives, there is a Republican majority on the District of Columbia Committee of the House of Representatives. So, yes, people who live in the nation's capital don't have their own fate in their hands.
I'd also add that if you're in California or a state that unambiguously is a blue state, you're practicing in a place where abortion could become a crime. We've seen during this campaign, not Donald Trump campaign officials, but those close to him, former administration officials outlining plans for what could be a kind of backdoor ban on all abortions using the federal Comstock Act, which is an obscenity law that's still on the books. So it's very clear that conservative activists and lawmakers have plans to make abortion a crime everywhere without Congress and without voters. So I think it's really important, even if you're living in a place that does have home rule, that maybe does have a ballot initiative protecting abortion rights, to recognize that you can't be complacent either, and that abortion opponents have already sketched out plans to essentially get rid of those rights or make them null and void.
Professor, please explain the mechanics of how this backdoor ban would work. The Republican nominee, the expected Republican nominee, has already speculated on a national ban at 15 or 16 weeks. But how would this outright ban that you've talked about using Comstock work?
So the Comstock Act was passed in 1873, and it was really an obscenity law. It talked about birth control, it talked about pornography, it talked about anything deemed obscene, which at the time was everything from great works of literature like the Decameron or the Canterbury Tales, or any art with like the Venus de Milo, to medical textbooks, and also to drugs and information about abortion. So activists who are very close to Donald Trump, including the lawyer who represented him in the U.S. Supreme Court in his case about disqualification and insurrection, including several people who were key figures in the first Trump administration who are still very close to him, argue that the Comstock Act's language on abortion should be interpreted as a ban on mailing any item related to abortion, including pills, but also including surgical instruments. And that if that's true, every abortion in the United States takes place with an item put in the mail. So they've been quite open with the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other publications that they expect Donald Trump to start enforcing this statute against abortion providers and drug manufacturers in blue states once he's elected. Trump himself hasn't said anything about that. He's, again, as you mentioned, focused on a 15-week ban that will never pass because, of course, it would require Congress. The interesting thing about this Comstock Act strategy is all that it would require would be a Trump Justice Department to initiate prosecutions and a conservative U.S. Supreme Court to say that those prosecutions were ultimately justified. In fact, the Comstock Act's meaning is before the U.S. Supreme Court potentially this week. We can't be sure, of course, that Donald Trump would do this. We can't be sure the Supreme Court would sign off if he tried. But this is a very much a real threat to abortion rights in blue states that has nothing to do with, I think, these sort of far-fetched proposals we've seen Trump propose, whether that's making some kind of grand bargain or a 15-week ban or a 16-week ban. None of those are going to happen. But savvy conservatives know that, and they already have a contrary game plan.
Given what we just heard, Dr. Perritt, you may be in the District of Columbia, but surely not all your members are. Are you already trading intelligence about how to handle, how to cope with what you just heard and what may be coming down the pike as a consequence of the 2024 election?
For sure. We have more than 500 doctors in our network, and certainly hundreds of other folks we are in relationship with that support access to comprehensive reproductive health care in our community. And there's a lot of conversation around contingency planning. What does it mean? One of the most robust conversations that we are having, the doctors in our network, is around the implications for medical education, for example. I think that folks don't understand what abortion bans do to access access to reproductive health care more broadly, to the number of OBGYNs in your community, the number of folks that can support you during your pregnancy and in the postpartum period, the connection between maternal mortality. So certainly the doctors in our network have been in conversation, not just over the last 2 years and not just in a space of concern or fear around the possibility of the Comstock law being enforced and expanded, but really the implications for our current work in this moment, and also what care looks like for the entire country moving forward if we are eliminating the ability to train doctors to care for the entire person throughout their reproductive life course.
So if I understand what you're saying, eventually, in some state teaching hospitals, you won't even be able to learn how to do an abortion.
Not just eventually, today. In some teaching hospitals, you cannot learn how to do an abortion. You do not learn how to provide contraceptive counseling care. You do not learn how to care for people who, even if you aren't performing the abortion, who are seeking abortion care or coming for an evaluation post that care. We've seen from recent data from the American Academy of Medical Colleges that the number of folks who apply to OBGYN residency programs has decreased in states where there are bans. We also know that the majority of trainees remain in the state where they train to practice. And so it stands to reason that if you have fewer folks that are practicing obstetrics and gynecology during their residency program moving to states with abortion bans, you will have fewer OBGYNs that are practicing those communities. It's also important to point out that states with the greatest number of abortion bans on the books are also the states with the worst outcomes for maternal and infant health, particularly as it relates to Black and Indigenous women and birthing people. So we will continue to see not just the implications from abortion bans for those who are forced to carry pregnancy to term, but an increase in the rates of maternal mortality across the board, and most specifically impacted or most specifically felt by Black women and birthing people.
Well, I hope down the road, as whatever future arrives, we can call on you both again. Dr. Jamila Perritt is the CEO of Physicians for Reproductive Health. Great to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
And Professor Mary Ziegler from the University of California, Davis School of Law. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manoukian and Sienna Barnes. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun and Gloria Duffy are CEOs of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. The clip from the preconceived film is courtesy of All Roads Productions, LLC. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.